Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 9 of my Knights of the Frozen Throne card review, this time around with 10 new cards, including the new Rogue Legendary Minion that was just revealed right before I started recording this video. So as always, as I do with my reviews, first I'm going to do detailed reviews of each of these cards, talking about them for a few minutes, talking about all the different aspects of what makes them good or bad. If you're not interested in a long format review and you just want to see the card reveals and you just want to get my overall take, you can skip to the end of the video using the link in the description below, where I'll just be doing quick reviews, so that'll save you some time. I understand. I forgive you for not listening to me ramble on for 25 minutes or more. But that said, that's exactly what I'm going to do right now. So let's go ahead and jump into these detailed reviews. First things first is the new Legendary Minion for Rogue. It's Lilian Voss, a famous rogue. We knew this one would eventually come to Hearthstone. She's finally here. It's a 4-mana, 4/5 minion, and she has a battle cry: replace spells in your hand with random spells from your opponent's class. So at a base level, we can see this is a Chillwind Yeti with a really interesting effect, clearly. So now we know Chillwind Yeti's okay. It's certainly not a great card on its own accord, so this effect has to be pretty solid to make this a playable card. So that's the question, isn't it? Is this battle cry actually any good? And I think the answer is maybe. Probably, maybe, somewhere around there. Essentially, the problem with replacing spells that you run in your deck with random spells is that typically your spells and the cards that you choose to include in your deck follow some sort of game plan or tend to do something specific, synergize with your other cards. For instance, Rogue runs a lot of weapon buffs. Maybe they run a weapon deck. If you run a lot of cheap spells for Gadgets and Auctioneer, etc., etc. So the question is, if you're replacing those with spells from your opponent, are you going to get junk that you could never use, like Shield Slam for Warriors, for instance, or maybe like Shatter from Mages? Those would be completely useless spells. So there's some risk associated with this. But if you build a deck in a specific way, for instance, Razor Petal style cards that give you a ton of Razor Petals back in your hand, if you can gather Razor Petals and maybe some counterfeit coins and backstabs that have lost their utility in the late game, and you can use Lilian Voss to transform those into Pyroblasts and Firelands Portals and Blizzards, it's probably okay that you get a Shatter or two, because at the end of the day, turning a 1 damage Razor Petal into a Shatter is a net loss. But if you can also turn a Razor Petal into a Firelands Portal, that's a pretty big gain in a value matchup. So I can envision this world where Lilian Voss is the kind of card that is a matchup flexible card. In other words, if say you're playing against a Pirate Warrior and you need things like Backstab and Razor Petals to help you keep up in tempo in the early game and just stay alive, then you can utilize those spells for that. But if you queue into like a Jade, who knows, let's not say Jade Idol, but some sort of control archetype deck, then you can use Lilian Voss to turn those comparatively weaker cards in that matchup into some bigger, heavier hitting things. You turn them into brawls and maybe shield blocks and anything else in execute, right, that's useful against a control warrior, for instance. So she gives you the ability to maybe try to fine-tune your deck, or at least your value opportunities, to fit the matchup that you're playing, which is pretty interesting. I just don't know if the risk is worth it necessarily, because it can really backfire. I also don't know how likely it is that a meta or a deck fits Lilian Voss specifically, but I do think she adds something really unique and interesting. Clearly that's an effect that does something significant, and often cards that have effects like that can carve out a place for themselves in one place or another. So I can see some potential with this card. Also, of course, it's worth noting that there are a lot of synergy cards with, making cards from your opponent's class cheaper. There's the Obsidian Shard, there's the Ethereal Peddler. Those kinds of cards can benefit in building that style of deck where you're stealing. So a Thief Rogue deck with Lilian Voss could finally come together really nicely, and there could be enough tempo advantages to essentially make Lilian Voss worth it, even if you do run the risk of getting some random stuff. As far as like rogue spells versus other classes spells, it's kind of a toss-up just depending upon the class. Some classes have stuff you'd never want to see. Other classes have some great high-end spells. So it's really hard to predict necessarily how good this could be based on the meta, because you don't know what the meta is going to look like when Lilian Voss is here. So essentially, a lot of variables contributing to whether or not this card could be successful, but given its raw stat value and the unique effect and the potential synergies of this effect, I can actually see Lilian Voss being played a fair bit, which, compared to a lot of the other legendary minions we've seen revealed so far in Knights of the Frozen Throne, might actually make her one of the standout legendary minions so far. So now let's move on to another rogue card. This time around it's the Runeforge Haunter, a new 4-mana minion. It is a 5/3, and its effect reads, during your turn, your weapon doesn't lose durability. So I actually think this is another interesting little card for rogue. We've seen a few different weapon synergy cards released already, things like the Vampiric Poison. We've got Envenom Weapon from the last expansion that both suffered from rogue not having good weapons and not being able to keep those weapons around and sometimes taking too much damage from those weapons. But now we've seen multiple cards that seem to be reinforcing and propping up this weapon rogue kind of archetype. And Runeforge Haunter here in particular fits really nicely with those weapon buff cards like the Vampiric Poison, like the Envenom Weapon, because you essentially get to extend their value if this minion is on the board. And I really think it only takes probably one instance of using your weapon to make this card worth it, because from a stat standpoint, a 5/3 for 4 mana isn't that bad. 3 health, clearly a weak spot at 4 mana. It can trade into a lot of things unfavorably and die very easily to the Frostbolts and Fiery War Axes of the world. But if you're able to use your weapon in a proactive way, because you played Runeforge Haunter to follow up a weapon play, and you're able to kill the stuff on board, it increases the likelihood that this survives. This is aggressively statted, so in a, kind of a tempo, mid-range, aggressive rogue deck, Runeforge Haunter seems like it could fit really nicely. It's just going to depend on whether or not Weapon Rogue is strong enough, if this card can actually support it. But I think the card is fundamentally okay. I think it does something that you like to see in Rogue and helps that archetype. So if that archetype thrives, this will be a card that could certainly fit into it. If Weapon Rogue does not become a thing, as far as just using your hero power without any buffs, this card does not offer enough return in value. Just getting one extra ping by sacrificing a pretty solid 4-drop in the place of Runeforge Haunter wouldn't be worth it. So this card is just completely conditional on whether or not Weapon Rogue can be good enough. Otherwise, this would be a pretty weak card. So now let's move on to an absolutely absurd-looking card. This is a new Hunter minion called the Corpse Widow. It's a 5-mana 4/6 minion. It's a beast, which is always important for Hunter. That's a really important tag to have. And its effect reads, your Death Rattle cards cost 2 less mana. And I think that is absolutely absurdly strong. Death Rattle Hunter has been a fringe deck already for a long time. There's plenty of Death Rattle synergy cards available to Hunter, plenty of good Death Rattle minions available to Hunter, and the Corpse Widow seems to tie all that together really nicely in a solidly statted minion for its cost. 4/6 is very good. 6 health in particular is strong because it makes this minion difficult to remove in the mid-game. Outside of Fireball or some really hard removal type spells, this is going to be a difficult minion for people to deal with, which means when it survives and in the following turn, you can really take advantage of this absurd effect and play tons of high-tempo, low-cost Death Rattle minions. And even when you do play Death Rattle minions, sometimes loading up a board is really risky and you don't want to overextend because your opponent can resolve your board and, Flame Strike you and you've wasted all your resources to a single removal spell. But Death Rattle minions sort of minimize that risk because typically they summon something in return. So even if this card causes you to overextend at some points, well, you're going to have minions left over afterwards, even if your opponent is able to deal with it in Flame Strikes or whatever it might be. Typically, it's not that big of a risk. You're not exposing yourself that much. Not to mention, you can eventually refill with N'Zoth and so many other things. So, Corpse Widow makes a lot of sense to me. I am actually surprised this card's a beast. I think it would still be good even if it wasn't a beast, but that means all the other things work really well with Corpse Widow too. And frankly, there's, Death Rattle minions that cost 1 and 2 mana, so even on turn 5, you can get multiple things out probably, thanks to Corpse Widow, instead of just having to wait to the next turn. So it's kind of got that immediate board swing potential, long-term value as well, high synergy card with its deck thanks to the Beast tag and the Death Rattle tags, and then finally just good stats for a 5-drop. This is like the perfect minion for Hunter. I can't imagine designing a card that fits them better. So Corpse Widow just seems perfect. It seems great. I don't think you can go wrong with Corpse Widow. Speaking of minions that fit their class perfectly, we have the Righteous Defender. Another one that is absolutely wonderful for Paladin. This is essentially an Argent Squire, 1 mana 1/1 with Divine Shield, but it's an Argent Squire with Taunt, which is frankly a really strong, powerful buff to a card, Argent Squire, that's already good. Argent Squire is already run by Paladins. It's been run in Murloc Paladin lists on the ladder today successfully. Argent Squire has historically been a great card for aggro decks, token decks, Zoo style decks, all of that stuff. Love running Argent Squire anyway because Divine Shield is so valuable, particularly when you can buff up the minion inside of it, which fits Paladin really nicely too. And Righteous Defender has that extra utility of having Taunt, so it's the kind of thing that's just really annoying to push through, so it can protect bigger threats, bigger assets, wider boards, can really get in the way of Arcanite Reapers and all those kinds of things. But it doesn't have to be a defensive card or an anti-aggro card by any means. This is also going to be good in aggressive Paladins, because sometimes you can hide a 3/1 behind a 1/1 and protect it for multiple turns and increase your damage output. So, not to mention, of course, this has some potential synergies with all the new Divine Shield cards coming in Paladin, so it's a good fit there. It's just a great card. Really, really solid card. Perfect for its cost. It's a Noyatron light, but significantly better than a Noyatron because it costs half as much mana, so a very flexible kind of card. It's just absolutely perfect for Paladin, much like the previous card was absolutely perfect for Hunter. This is a fantastic card. And now up next we have some Priest cards, starting off with a 5-mana spell called Devour Mind. This one is basically Thought Steal, but instead of copying 2 cards from your opponent's deck, this one allows you to copy 3 cards for 2 additional mana. And really, this one's just too slow. Thought Steal right now is too slow. It's been played a little bit in the past. It's harder and harder to play right now. Priest has so many other good options. Radiant Elemental and Shadow Visions in particular just make Priest have a lot better spell options around the same kinds of mana costs. So Devour Mind doesn't seem like it'll replace Thought Steal. Thought Steal is just way more flexible. It's more efficient because you get 2 cards for 3 mana instead of 3 for 5. So you kind of have to pay 2 extra mana to only get 1 extra card with Devour Mind, which from a card slot in your deck standpoint is more efficient, but much less efficient from a tempo mana cost standpoint. So it feels considerably weaker than Thought Steal in and of itself. This is the kind of thing you're going to be fairly happy to get off Lyra sometimes if you're not looking to chain cheap spells. But otherwise, not a card that's going to make constructed lists all that often, I think. Because, again, at the end of the day, as we talked about with the Rogue Legendary Minion, getting cards from your opponent's deck, they're typically lower synergy, they don't fit your game plan that well. There's a lot of risk associated with that. So even if you could run Thought Steal or Devour Mind, if the meta was slow enough, I'm still not sure you'd actually want to. Priest has better options, as I mentioned. More high synergy cards and high synergy plays these days, thanks to Shadow Visions. So Devour Mind just feels like a pretty weak card for Priest at this point. So up next for Priest is actually a crazy card. This is the Obsidian Statue, a new 9-mana minion, which is a really rare sight for class minions and priest minions in particular. This is a 4/8, and it has Taunt, and it has Lifesteal, and it has Death Rattle, destroy a random enemy minion. So that's a lot of effects bundled into a single card. And I have to say, I think this is one of the few 9-mana cards that you can actually play in Constructed. There aren't very many 9-mana cards historically that have been played a lot. 10-mana cards, only with really strong battle cries that have instant effects, usually get played. 9-mana cards, same story, Alexstrasza, Ysera, those kinds of things that give you instant value in some way or another. Obsidian Statue might be one of those cards just because a 4/8 Taunt with Lifesteal in and of itself is very defensively minded, and it does actually have an instant impact on the board, given that it's Taunt. In other words, your opponent does have to trade minions into it, and that has the potential to heal you a ton. If they have hard removal, clearly Obsidian Statue gets worse. Hex, Polymorph, etc., right? That's clearly the weakness of this card, as it is with any big threat style minion. So that's very meta dependent, right? But and of course, I should note, this card is slow, as is every 9-mana card. They're all slow. It's hard to find decks. It's hard to find metas that support this slow of a play. But this is the kind of thing where it does enough that it can afford to be that slow because it has taunt, because if they don't address it immediately, that lifesteal can really start to pile up and give you a ton of health. So if you get this down against an aggro deck on turn 9, you've already won the game probably because you're on turn 9 against an aggro deck, so it's maybe not necessarily that helpful. It sometimes might be the final nail in the coffin. But against a mid-range deck, even against control decks, this thing starts to really spiral out of control with that lifesteal, so they have to deal with it. And then there's actually this crazy death rattle that you destroy a random enemy minion. So in a control environment, you're going to get some value back. You're going to kill something of your opponents. Yeah, they might be able to control it in some way that it's a small thing, but it's removal. It's a giant body they have to work through. Something dies if they do successfully work through it, but you also get lifesteal out of it, so you gain some life. Like, it's a lot in this card, and I think it actually kind of works. So it also has death rattle synergies to consider. Clearly, Priest has a couple different ways to take advantage of death rattles with N'Zoth, but also with the Quest Priest that we haven't really seen be very successful. So I can see multiple angles where this card works. It's also, of course, going to be very, very popular in the card Free from Amber, which sometimes gets ran in Control Priest because it's the only Priest card that's higher than the mana cost requirement for Free from Amber. So it's going to show up way more because it gets sort of the bias of a class card in those Discover style effects. So it's going to be there all the time. So it existing, even if it doesn't get played and constructed, is really important just for Free from Amber and those kinds of effects. So it's a great Barnes target, by the way, too, if Priest wants to run Barnes. There's just a lot of different ways to use this guy and a lot of advantages, it seems like to me, of him being in your deck. He's a great Resurrect target. I think this was in fact probably teased as one of the best Resurrect targets ever with things like Eternal Servitude, the new card. So I like Obsidian Statue. I almost always say 9 mana cards are too slow. They don't make enough of an impact instantly. But I think this one makes the cut. I think it's doing enough and defensive enough. And since it has taunt, all of those things add up to a card that works as a final finisher against aggro and mid-range, and it even has a lot of control matchup value as well, thanks to this death rattle. So, even though it's slow, even though it costs 9 mana, and 9 mana is considerably worse than 8 mana, I think this might still be a playable card. So up next, I have a new mage spell. This time it's called Glacial Mysteries. It's an 8 mana spell. And it's basically Mysterious Challenger, but it's a spell because it puts one of each secret from your deck into the battlefield. And everybody knows Mysterious Challenger was a ridiculous card that defined the meta for a really, really long time. I don't think that's Glacial Mysteries. I think this is considerably worse than Mysterious Challenger. First and foremost, it costs extra mana than Mysterious Challenger, which makes sense because mage secrets cost more than paladin secrets, right? But secondarily to that, it doesn't develop a minion immediately, so there's no immediate board impact, nothing your opponent has to deal with, no big stats, nothing like that. So it's a pretty passive and defensive and risky play sometimes because even if you do have a lot of secrets, your opponent, can kind of dictate things. You don't apply a lot of pressure with mage secrets. They're just kind of sitting back and doing their own thing. They're not getting out on the board and making an immediate impact. So it's more of a value line versus a tempo line or a board line, which is really, really slow. Beyond that, I think the problem with Glacial Mysteries is a deck building challenge, right? You could include up to 5 secrets to get 5 secrets immediately drawn via Glacial Mysteries. But the problem with that is I'm not sure there are actually 5 good secrets available to mage that you'd want to run in your deck because this is an 8 mana play. You have a lot of time, a lot of turns to draw into those secrets, and it's sometimes hard to use those secrets in a way that makes sense prior to playing your Glacial Mysteries. So in other words, if you run that many secrets, you really compromise the integrity of your deck and your draw. That's not the case with Secret Mage right now, because you can pull out a lot of secrets with Arcanologist. You have really high tempo plays to play those secrets immediately often. So that deck fits really well together, and it typically only runs, 4 to 5 secrets, a couple Mirror Entities, a couple counter spells, Ice Blocker 2. This would theoretically require you to run multiple more of that if you wanted to get full max value out of your Glacial Mysteries. So You might have to run 6, 8, even up to 10 secrets for this to make a lot of sense. You could just run one of each secret, but then if you play Glacial Mysteries and you've already drawn 2, you're only summoning 3 secrets. Like, yes, that's a technical mana advantage because that would have cost 9 to play, and you get it for 8. But Mage already has a lot of ways to cheat out cheap secrets and get full discounts on secrets while also developing the board. So this feels like a very difficult deck building challenge for a deck that already does it really well, and Mage already uses secrets really well, thanks to cards like Arcanologist, Kirin Mage, even Cabal Lackey, etc., that I just don't think Glacial Mysteries, at its cost, is going to be worth it. I actually think this card exists to nerf Primordial Glyph, because if, most Mage decks aren't going to have enough secrets for Glacial Mysteries to make sense off of Primordial Glyph, this is just kind of an expensive throwaway spell that's occasionally going to take up a spot in Primordial Glyph and make it weaker. So I think this one's going to be really difficult to work with, guys. I know it looks like Mysterious Challenger right away, but the more you think about it, the more you try to put it in context, you have a lot of difficulties making this one fit. So up next is another Mage spell. This time it's called Simulacrum. It's a 3-mana spell, and it does actually have some of the most confusing wording of any card I've seen. I read this like 5 times and still didn't actually know what this card did, and I had to reread the article it was revealed in to actually understand the context of this card. So that's a little unfortunate. The card reads, copy the lowest cost minion in your hand. And I didn't know immediately if that meant it becomes a 3-mana version of the lowest cost minion in your hand, almost like it transforms, like a Shifter Xeris, for instance, where the card always changes in your hand and becomes that for 3 mana, because that seems like it could be that. I didn't know if it meant copy it onto the board, for instance. It should say summon in that instance, so I didn't think that was the case. What this actually means is when you cast Simulacrum, if you play the card for 3 mana, it will create a new card of the lowest cost minion in your hand. In other words, if you have a Sorcerer's Apprentice sitting in your hand and you cast Simulacrum, you'll get a regular Sorcerer's Apprentice at its regular cost back in your hand. If somehow Archmage Antonidas is the lowest cost card in your hand, you can cast Simulacrum, you'll get a second Antonidas in your hand. And that's actually kind of cool. That has a couple different potential synergies. The first things that jump to mind are like Arcane Giants, for instance. If you reduce their cost to 0, you can basically get a 3-mana Arcane Giant for 0 mana. So you get like an extra 8/8 body for the 3-mana cost of Simulacrum. For combo potentials, I already teased Sorcerer's Apprentice, Archmage Antonidas. You can create copies of those to help you find your Exodia combo faster, or maybe have a backup for your Exodia combo if you need to. So there's some potentials there. You can maybe make double Malagos somehow if your deck works out to support that the right kind of way. So I don't think this is necessarily a good play most of the time for the average deck, because usually getting a second copy of just a random minion and paying 3 mana of a penalty to do that, because remember, this does cost 3 mana itself. So if you get a Sorcerer's Apprentice, you spent 5 total mana to play that second extra copy of your Sorcerer's Apprentice. In an Exodia deck, that's fine, because you can front load this mana cost and sacrifice 3 mana now for your combo later. That works out okay. In the average deck, you'd never want to pay a 3 mana penalty to draw a single card. So I think the applications for this card are strictly limited to some sort of combo deck or shenanigans deck, or some play designed specifically to use Simulacrum. I don't think this is just a part of the Mage arsenal in a normal everyday kind of deck. So not necessarily a bad card, because it does do something really cool. Basically allows you to create a second copy of a legendary that would otherwise never be allowed. So it has a unique effect, not necessarily an efficient effect, but a strong one nonetheless. So those kinds of cards can find decks sometimes, and I wouldn't be surprised if somebody creates some sort of shenanigan with Simulacrum to make some kind of cool player combo deck. Might even just be normal in Exodia Mage if that still remains or becomes an even better deck. So a playable card, just not an everyday, really strong kind of card. So to finish off this review, I have 2 neutral minions, the first of which is the Tomb Lurker. This is a new 5-mana, 5/3 minion with a battle cry that reads, add a random Death Rattle minion that died this game to your hand. So essentially this is a potential Death Rattle synergy card. It actually falls in line with cards like Lotus Agent, even kind of Azure Drake, where it's a 5 mana, draw a card kind of card. But I think it's actually weaker than both instances of those cards. If you play this on curve, you're unlikely to get anything really strong just because, most of the minions played thus far are 1 to 4 mana. So you're probably more likely to hit, 2, 3 mana card on average, which, drawing an extra 2 mana Death Rattle, 3 mana Death Rattle is fine. There's nothing wrong with that play. It's just probably not as strong as other alternatives that exist for most decks that are running Death Rattle synergy cards specifically. It's interesting, this Battlecry is not... it's not specific to the player. It does say random Death Rattle minion, so presumably, based on my understanding of this card, if your opponent played a Tyrion and you killed their Tyrion, and that's the only Death Rattle minion that died this game, you could actually get a Tyrion in your hand, which would be cool, but that's a really, really, really specific scenario that's incredibly unlikely. Why would you ever run this if you don't already have Death Rattle cards in your deck? So I don't think that's a consideration to make. It's just an interesting read on the card text here. But anyway, it just doesn't seem like it's good enough to fit in a Death Rattle deck. It's not a Death Rattle itself. Really weak, 3 health for 5 mana. So that's a real risk there as well. You're basically throwing out a body that's very unlikely to survive just to draw a card that on average won't actually be that strong. And if you do have a full deck of Death Rattles, you're not likely to get the really high cost ones you want. You're not going to get the Obsidian Statue every time. If you did somehow put this in a deck that only ran 1 Death Rattle that was a really high value minion, I guess that's kind of a cool application, but still, again, I just don't think this card itself is good enough to make the cut in Constructed, so this feels like a weak card to me. And then finally, we have the Corpse Raiser. This is actually another sort of Death Rattle synergy style card. Another 5 mana one at that, but it only has 3/3 in stats this time. And the battle cry reads, give a friendly minion Death Rattle, re-summon this minion. So essentially this is the card Ancestral Spirit for Shamans, which is a 2 mana spell that gives the exact same effect to a minion, but it's attached to a body. And it's attached to a 3/3 body, which would be about a 3 mana minion. You get a 2 mana spell. So those pieces fit together. That feels like a fair mana cost for this card and the effect. So it gives Ancestral Spirit essentially to every class, when only Shaman had it previously. Ancestral Spirit has been used in some interesting ways in Shaman. I think there's some potential for Corpse Raiser to be used in some interesting ways for other classes too. I don't think this is a one of in every Death Rattle deck. I don't think it's that strong. I don't think the effect is going to be that good for most classes. But I can see occasionally this pops up where it makes sense in a certain class who maybe doesn't have enough Death Rattle synergies, or maybe has some card that's really, really good to resummon. We've even seen this in like crazy combos with charging minions and stuff. So who knows exactly how this card could be utilized. I don't think it's the strongest card. I don't think it's an everyday card. But it's one of those cards that has potential as a neutral minion to make an appearance here and there. And that's good. It's a cool design. It gives something to everybody that was never available before. So I like Corpse Raiser quite a bit for that regard. And there you go, guys. That was it for my long format review of each of those cards. Some cool ones, some really interesting designs. Once again, that seems to be a theme so far. Neat new stuff we've never seen before, which I really, really like. That said, what I'd like to do now is jump into the quick reviews of each of these cards, where I'll rate them from 1 to 5 stars. So let's go ahead and jump into these quick ones. I think Lilian Voss is a 3-star card. I think Runeforge Haunter is a 3-star card. I think Corpse Widow is a 5-star card. I think Righteous Defender is another 5-star card. That's pretty crazy, but both of those fit their classes so darn well. I think Devouring Mind is a 1-star card. I think Obsidian Statue is a 4-star card. Could be slow, granted, but it's a really, really strong card. I think Glacial Mysteries is a 2-star card. I think Simulacrum is a 2-star card. I think Tomb Lurker is a 1-star card. And I think Corpse Raiser is a 2-star card. And there you go, guys. That's part 9 of my Knights of the Frozen Throne card review. One of my favorite little sets of cards yet. Couple 5-star cards in a single review, which we haven't seen yet. I just haven't given that many cards 5 stars, so I'm pretty excited. Some really good fits for Paladin and Hunter. Kind of scary good, but we'll see how they shake out. All that said, guys, I'm sure some of you think I'm absolutely insane. Some of you think I am stupid, and I'd love to hear those thoughts. I want to hear everything you have to say. Tell me why I'm wrong. Convince me otherwise. Tell me what cards are good. Tell me what cards are bad. I like to see everything you have to say in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.